motor racing was basically born in Britain. It was British racetracks that were home to some of the most iconic races in history. But when World War left the entire country bombed and in rubble, the entire sport seemed like it was doomed. That is, until one family brought it back to life and created a racing event that is now considered one of the most significant in the entire world, the Goodwood Festival of Speed. So let's take a look at the history of British motor racing and see how one wealthy lineage led to the revival of car culture in the UK, and very well may have saved the entire British racing industry. I'm Guff, this is Albon, let's get started. The first car race ever on record happened the way most car races do. Two macho dudes lining up in the middle of the night to see whose self-propelled horseless carriage was faster. The two dudes were Daniel Anderson and Isaac Watt Bolton, both engineers who worked on steam engines in the 19th century. And on a cold night in 1867, they wanted to see who had the fastest carriage. So they got a small crowd together, and at 4:30 a.m., they lined up on a road in a small town called Ashton-under-Lyne. They set off in their most likely steam-powered cars, putting down all 10 to 15 horsepower they had available. And they ripped down the British countryside neck and neck down a pre-planned 8-mile course. And after a nail-biting, although probably quite slow race, it was Isaac Watt Bolton who crossed the line and took the win. It turns out though, we all won in that race, because from that point on, people couldn't get enough of motor racing. And as the automobile began to take the world by storm and more widely produced internal combustion engines became available, racing grew far beyond just Britain. The French, for example, were huge on competition, and in 1894, one of the first widely recognized sanctioned races occurred in Paris. It had 102 entrants, racing 79 miles from Paris to Rouen. In 1906, the world's first purpose-built circuit, Aspendale Raceway, was built in Australia. But, of course, the Brits, not to be outdone, had to make sure they were dominating the racing scene. A very wealthy businessman by the name of Hugh Fortescue Locke King saw the massive growth of racing all across Europe, especially France, and he knew that if the British car industry was to stand a chance against all of these other Europeans, they needed a proper place to test their cars. Why not just test them on the road, you ask? Well, a few years earlier, the British Motor Car Act of 1903 enacted a strict 20-mile-an-hour speed limit across the country. And it was then that Hugh King realized that if there was no place to test British motor cars properly, then they would stand no chance against the French. So just 4 years later, in 1907, the world's first banked racing circuit was built by Mr. King himself, and it was called the Brooklands Circuit. And it was from that moment on that the British car industry really took off. The first race on the circuit happened just 11 days after its opening, with 3 teams competing to beat the 24-hour distance driving record. Yes, their first race was a 24-hour endurance race, and over 10,000 people showed up to watch. And after 24 hours, the winner was Selwyn Edge, a truly serious racer who drove the entire 24-hour stint by himself. He covered 1,581 miles, handily beating the old record of about 1,100 miles. And the whole country was abuzz after this race. People just couldn't get enough of these highly publicized motor races. Later, Percy Lambert became the first person to ever drive 100 miles an hour at Brooklands Circuit. Then George Stanley broke the motorcycle distance record on Brooklands Circuit. And Violette and Evelyn Cordery, two Speed Demon sisters, set a world record for driving 30,000 miles in less than 30,000 minutes. That's over 20 days, by the way. All on the legendary Brooklands Circuit. This place was truly magical. Any and all feats of motor racing history were performed on these hallowed grounds, until it all came to a screeching halt, thanks to World War I. By the way, if you like the story so far, please do hit the subscribe button. We got a lot more coming up. In July of 1914, the First World War officially began, and Great Britain was deep in the war effort. Now, one thing I didn't mention before is that Brooklands wasn't just a racing circuit. It was also one of Britain's first airfields. And when wartime came, the British War Office shut down the circuit and dedicated the entire Brooklands property to military flight training. By 1915, Vickers Aviation was even producing their Wellington military planes there, and any memory of motor racing was long gone. But of course, the war didn't last forever. And in 1918, when the armistice was signed and peace was restored, many people wondered if racing would ever return to Brooklands. The track was in a major state of disrepair, but Hugh King and his merry band of miscreants went to work restoring the track to its former glory. And 2 years later, in 1920, racing was back at the Brooklands. For the next few years, people went racing mad in England. There were cars like the Chitty Bang Bang, driven by Count Louis Zabrowski, which was powered by a 23-liter 6-cylinder Maybach engine, and it was winning races in the early 20s. By 1926, they even began hosting Grand Prix races at the Brooklands, where the fastest of French, Italian, German, and British racers went head-to-head to prove their dominance. And in the 1930s, speed records were broken year after year by speed demons from all over the country. It was truly a golden era for motor racing in the UK. Until, well, we had another war. 1939, World War. Again. And just like last time, racing was stopped at the Brooklands and they focused fully on making military planes. The German Luftwaffe were on a bombing campaign through England. And despite their best attempts to camouflage Brooklands airfield, on September 1940, the Germans found them and bombed them. It was brutal. 90 people killed, over 400 injured, and the entire grounds destroyed. The factories, the airfield, the circuit, everything. And when the war ended in 1945, Brooklands was still in ruins. The entire property ended up being sold a few months later to Vickers Armstrong Aviation, where they slowly began to rebuild the aircraft factory. And as they rebuilt, they needed more space for their runways, and so much of the legendary Brooklands circuit was paved over and forgotten. The once beating heart of British motor racing was officially buried. And that was it. The future of motorsports in Britain seemed bleak. Hugh King had passed away in 1926 and he had no heirs. And so there was no chance of the Brooklands circuit ever returning in any form. That being said, gearheads were still street racing, mostly on now unused Air Force runways like RAF Silverstone. But there were basically no real sanctioned races since the war ended. And that didn't sit right with a lot of people. One person in particular being the 9th Duke of Richmond, Freddie March. Now remember the name March because his family is important. Freddie was an amateur racer who had a pretty decent record at the Brooklands, most notably winning the Brooklands 500 and the Brooklands Double 12 races. And when war broke out, he served in the Royal Air Force. But after the war, he found himself with a lot of time and a pretty big inheritance: the Goodwood estate. This was a 12,000-acre property first established in the 1600s by the first Duke of Richmond, Charles Lennox. And since the 1600s, the estate was constantly in development. First a home, then a stable and kennel for the horses, and eventually a horse track around the perimeter. Hell, the third Duke of Richmond even added a golf course. So when Freddie finally took over, he did what anyone would do with 12,000 acres and a background in motorsports. He built a freaking racetrack. Taking a page from Hugh King's playbook, he realized if he wanted a racetrack, he'd just have to build it his goddamn self. And just like that, construction on the Goodwood circuit started, and finally brought back a glimmer of hope for the future of motorsports. And in September of 1948, the West Sussex-based Goodwood Motor Circuit finally opened its doors to the public, thus becoming the first post-war permanent racing venue. And for their opening event, people went absolutely bananas. There were over 15,000 spectators and 85 people signed up to drive as well. It was one of the biggest motor racing events in the country, and I think it's safe to say that British motor racing was back, and it was Freddie March and the Goodwood circuit that led this motor racing renaissance. Because not long after, RAF Silverstone opened up as Silverstone Circuit, a proper racing circuit. And a few years later, Brands Hatch hosted their first race as well. Motorsports began to grow so rapidly that by 1950, Silverstone was home to the first World Championship race of Formula One. And then by 1954, Aintree Circuit was built, and it shared Formula One British Grand Prix duty with Silverstone. In just a few short years, there were a litany of tracks and races all across England, and the country was absolutely in love with motor racing once again. And of course, Goodwood was home to some of the most iconic racing moments in all of history. Mike Hawthorne and Graham Hill had their first ever open-wheel races at Goodwood, proper F1 legends. Then in 1963, Roger Penske hustled a Ferrari 250 GTO around Goodwood. In 1964, Jim Clark battled Jack Sears in his prime, all alongside Graham Hill as well. If you wanted to see the fastest drivers and the most amazing racing, you had to go to Goodwood. But it wasn't all wreaths and champagne. As fast as motorsports was growing around the world, the speed of these cars was evolving even faster. In 1948, Stirling Moss won his first ever event at Goodwood, and over the years he went on to compete at Goodwood 56 times, winning 21 of those. He would break his own lap records year after year, getting faster and faster. Hell, he even became known as Mr. Goodwood. What a name. But in 1962, right after Easter, it was at Goodwood that Stirling Moss's racing career tragically ended. It was the 10th annual Glover Trophy, and in typical Stirling Moss fashion, he was going absolutely flat out. But towards the end of the race, on the fastest section of the track, he lost control of his Lotus and crashed in a horrific way. He had a broken leg and ankle, a broken left arm, a crushed cheekbone, and perhaps most seriously of all, severe brain damage. He was quickly rushed to the hospital and treated for his numerous injuries, but the head trauma was the real danger. Stirling Moss was in a coma for nearly a month, and for the 6 weeks after that, one entire side of his body was paralyzed. Stirling Moss never returned to professional racing. And for Mr. Goodwood himself to meet such a fate at the track of his namesake was enough to give pause to the entire racing industry. It was becoming more and more evident every year that these circuits needed to adapt to the increasing speed and technology of these new cars. But despite the pleading of numerous teams and drivers, Goodwood's organizers refused to add chicanes to the track to reduce speed in its fastest sections. And that was a mistake, because as more racing incidents happened and more drivers began to grow apprehensive, Goodwood's popularity began to fade. And in 1966, Freddie March himself realized that Goodwood was just too dangerous. So he made the call, and for the first time since the war, Goodwood officially closed its gates to motorsport. But despite how iconic Goodwood was, its shutting down wasn't as devastating to the racing industry as it was back then. England still had Aintree, Brands Hatch, and of course Silverstone. And with Formula One quickly on the rise, racing in the UK continued to grow, even without Goodwood. Over the next 30 years, we saw some of the most legendary races take place on English soil, with drivers like Peter Collins, Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, James Hunt, John Watson, and of course the international drivers who came and left their mark in England as well, like Alain Prost, Niki Lauda, and of course Ayrton Senna. And to ensure that they didn't end up like Goodwood, these circuits saw constant evolution as the cars got faster. Silverstone added a chicane in 1975, and in 1987 it was changed again. And in 1991, after even more crashes and offs in Grand Prix races, they decided to completely redesign the entire track to be far more technical and slower than the previous Silverstone was. It seemed counterintuitive. Racing was inherently about speed, but the safety of the drivers was something that the race organizers knew was crucial to the long-term survival of the sport. But as the years went on and racing became more technical, more advanced, more safe, many traditionalists still yearned for the old days. The days of 20+ liter engines, no sound restrictions, and little racing regulation. Drivers heroically driving death traps around a quintessentially British estate. And one of those traditionalists was none other than the grandson of Freddie March, named after his great-great-great-grandfather, the first Duke of Richmond, Charles Lennox. You see, in the early 90s, Charles found himself in a very similar position that his grandfather was in 50 years prior. He had just inherited the Goodwood estate and had quite a penchant for motorsports. And so he hatched a plan to bring back Goodwood to its former glory, a racing circuit that was a celebration of motorsports in Great Britain. But there was just one issue. This was the modern era, and he couldn't get the necessary permits to build a racetrack. There were noise regulations, angry British Karens, a lot of bureaucratic red tape. It wasn't going to be easy to restore his grandfather's vision. And so he thought, well, let's try something else. Something that would get the racing fans excited again about Goodwood while he sorted out the bureaucrats in the background. And that something was the Goodwood Festival of Speed. Hosted on his own grounds in the Goodwood estate, the Festival of Speed was an invitational hill climb for owners of historic vehicles. And it was really freaking cool. Where else could you see V16 BRMs, classic Astons, Jaguars, Maseratis? Hell, they even had vintage Formula One cars in attendance, all ripping up the Goodwood hill climb at eye-watering of Speed. And despite the fact that this event was held on the same day as the 24 Hours of Le Mans, 25,000 people still showed up to get a glimpse into what British motor racing used to be. And year by year, it grew. In 1994, Saturday was added, making it a weekend event. And in 1996, they added Friday to the roster as well. The Earl of March even added the Cordier Style et Lux event, which was a car show situated right next to the Goodwood house, with celebrities judging the finest and most pristine cars on the planet. And all the while, the Earl of March continued to work in the background to bring back Goodwood Circuit. As the festival grew, he began to pour more money and resources into rebuilding the circuit exactly how it was when his grandfather ran the show. On top of that, thanks to the popularity of the festival, he had a growing lobby called the Goodwood Supporters Association. And with their help, he finally managed to secure the permits necessary to open up a racing circuit. So on September 18, 1998, exactly 50 years from when Goodwood Circuit first opened, the Earl of March officially christened the track in the same Bristol 400 that his grandfather drove 5 decades prior. Goodwood was finally back in all its former glory. A new event called the Goodwood Revival was created to relive those olden days. Not only did people race their vintage cars on this classic circuit, but they also dressed in period clothes. They had car shows for period cars, and they just all around celebrated the glory days of Goodwood. No modern vehicles were allowed near the circuit for the entire weekend, save for emergency vehicles. And there were even air shows of vintage planes and war-era bombers, not to mention dozens of races in a number of categories. Races for different generations, engine sizes, makes, and so on. And over the years, it only got bigger and better. In 2000, they added a supercar paddock. They even had a soapbox derby. In 2005, they opened up a rally car demonstration that was so popular, the next year they turned it into a full-on rally stage. And while this sounds like the most awesome car event ever, it wasn't all so rosy. Goodwood shut down in the 60s for being too dangerous, and it seemed that the reborn Goodwood just couldn't escape that. In its very first event in 1993, motorcycle racer Chaz Guy was killed when he lost control of his bike and was thrown into a tree. The Earl of March, though, knew what happened to his grandfather, and so he took swift action and stopped timing motorcycle runs. A few years later, though, in 2000, John Dawson Damer lost control of his Lotus 63 and crashed into the finish line gantry, which not only killed him, but also killed the marshal, Andrew Carpenter, while seriously injuring another. This was a massive tragedy, one that really rocked the foundation of Goodwood's organizers. But again, they decided to keep going. The combined passion of motoring fans in Britain was enough to keep Goodwood alive, and so they continued on, making iterative changes to try and keep people safe. And since then, there haven't been any fatal incidents, which is proof that Goodwood always had the ability to be the de facto face of British motor racing. It just needed proper leadership. Today, Goodwood continues to grow, and now they're looking towards the future rather than just the past. There's now a science and technology pavilion, and even an arena for drifting and stunt driving. And now even EVs are a big part of Goodwood, with the current Goodwood hill climb record set by Romain Dumas in the Volkswagen IDR at just 39.9 seconds. And thanks to all that, Goodwood is now more popular than ever, with visitors from all over the world. So many that Goodwood had to cap attendance at 150,000. And all these years later, Goodwood is proof of the tenacity of motor racing. Through war, tragedy, countless setbacks, the residents of the United Kingdom have never forgotten about the significance of motor racing. And it's thanks to people like Hugh King, Charles and Freddie March, and the countless organizers, marshals, drivers, and fans that today Brits can continue to keep calm and race on. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please do hit the like button, it really helps the channel, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.